How precious is your steadfast love, O God! The children of mankind take refuge in the shadow of your wings. For with you is the fountain of life. In your light we see light. Welcome back to our Light from the Light channel. I'm Dr. Robbie Dean. I am the pastor of West Houston Bible Church and the president of Dean Bible Ministries. And we have published a booklet called God's Powerful Promises. And as many of you know, we have been going through this booklet in the order that the promises are listed as studying them. And we have broken down many of the promises of God according to category. And so we just finished a category called God's Comfort for the Believer. And now we're looking at a category about God's faithfulness. God's faithfulness emphasizes the fact that because he is immutable, a God who doesn't change, then he is faithful to always do the same thing that he has said he will do. He never changes. Jesus Christ is said to be the same yesterday, today, and forever. So we're looking at these promises now that relate to who God is and his faithfulness to us as believers. Our memory verse for today is Psalm 37:25. And this is a verse that emphasizes God's faithfulness in sustaining believers and taking care of us. He watches over us individually. He never gets too busy somewhere else. He is always 100% focused. All of his being is focused 100% of the time on every single individual believer. You are special to God because you are his child. He has adopted you into his royal family, which is the body of Christ, the church. You are a church age believer. Now, the passage that we're looking at is one that is not from the church age. It is from the age of Israel and the dispensation of the law. And so it has to be interpreted within that framework, but the principle and the implications are for us as well. In Psalm 37:25, we read, I have been young and now I am old, yet I have not seen the righteous forsaken, nor his descendants begging bread. Psalm 37:25. So this is a verse that the speaker is King David, the writer of this psalm. And he is talking about the faithfulness of God. And so as we look at Psalm 37, it's very interesting to examine the context here because it is very similar to a context we just looked at in Psalm chapter 94. In Psalm 94, we were actually looking at Psalm 94:19, but we went back to the beginning, if you remember, and the psalmist is asking the question, how long shall the wicked, O Lord, how long shall the wicked prosper? How long shall the wicked exalt? We have the same kind of thing going on here in Psalm 37. For as we look at this context, it is a wisdom psalm that is directly connected, in fact, to the previous psalm. And we look at how it is connected to the last verse of Psalm 36, which reads, there the workers of iniquity have fallen. They have been cast down and are not able to rise. And then we come to the beginning of Psalm 37, and it says, do not fret, which means don't be angry. Do not fret because of evildoers, nor be envious of the workers of iniquity. So you see that phrase, workers of iniquity, is used in the last verse of Psalm 36, and it's picked up again in the first verse of Psalm 31. Who are these workers of iniquity? It's used in synonymous parallelism with evildoers at the end of the first line of this particular psalm. And this refers to those who are not believers and those who are hostile to the plans and purposes of God. And a lot of times today, we find Christians who struggle with the apparent and very real prosperity of those who are not only wicked and evil on their own, but they also appear to prosper and promote evil. They have large corporations that are engaged in the promotion of things which the Bible describes as evil. They are antagonistic to God and His Word and antagonistic to Christians. But it seems like they live their life scot free of any negative consequences. Part of that may be because we just don't know whatever the negative consequences might be. But God has a plan and purpose for them. So we're told at the beginning of this psalm, do not fret because of evil doers. Now, that's an interesting English word, fret. It's somewhat antiquated. And actually, there's four distinct words in English, four totally different meanings, and come from four, historically, they derive from four older languages. So this is a verb, others are nouns. And this has an ancient origin in Germanic language, which a lot of English is that way. And it is a verb that means to be constantly anxious, constantly upset, visibly upset. And it also has the idea of something that gradually wears away by rubbing or gnawing. A third meaning is to flow or move in small waves. And so we can think about how these relate. Sometimes we just have waves of anger, resentment against people who seem to be getting away with their evil. And it's an anger that's constantly there, and it just rubs us the wrong way. So we can see how all of those nuances can blend together in this one particular word. It also is related to an Old English word, fretan, which means to devour, feed upon, or consume. And so when we fret, that anger, that resentment eats us up. So all of these words kind of come together in an antiquated word that we still use at times as we just fret over things. We worry. It eats away at our soul. And so we need to deal with that because we need to confess it. It's a sin. And we need to recognize that there's no reason for us to be angry and fret about these things, that God is just and He's righteous and He's going to take care of things. So this psalm is emphasizing the righteousness of God's providence, that this is going to be vindicated in history. And so eventually all of the evildoers are going to get their just reward. But in the meantime, God deals with them in grace, and He is using their hostility to believers, and He's using their self-centeredness in order to demonstrate certain things in history. And so as we go through this psalm, we see a contrast between the prosperity and power of many wicked people who appear to be getting away with it, in contrast to the fact that many of the righteous, who in the language of the Psalms refers to believers, the suffering of the righteous, and they lack things. So the contrast between wicked, we're describing unbelievers who are still fallen in sin. They do not have the imputation of righteousness. And the righteous are those who are saved. They're not perfect, but they have received the imputation of God's righteousness by faith in His saving promise. And that is so important to remember. Remember Genesis 15:6, that Abraham believed God and it was imputed to him as righteousness. That's the idea here, is that they're not perfect. They fall sometimes, they fail, but they are righteous. They are eternally saved. So God holds out to the righteous this promise of His protective care. He's going to take care of us. And so when we look at our verse at Psalm 37:25, it falls within a section of this psalm that deals with God's provision for believers. And this whole section from verse 21 down to 33, the psalmist calls on the congregation that he's addressing to demonstrate their faith with a life of wisdom, because the Lord will bless them. And so he describes in 21 to 26 the way that the Lord takes care of the righteous. And that's where we find our verse 25. He says in verse 21 and 22, let me read them for you. The wicked borrows and does not pay back, but the righteous is gracious and gives. For those blessed by him will inherit the land, but those cursed by him will be cut off. By inheriting the land, he's referring in a Jewish context, the context of the Mosaic Law, to those who will eventually inherit the land that God promised to them, and they will possess it. If not now in this life, then in the future, when the resurrection of the dead occurs and the righteous go into the kingdom, the millennial kingdom. In verse 23, the steps of a man are established by the Lord, and he delights in his way. That's talking about the righteous man. In verses 23 to 24, excuse me, I just read verse 23. Verse 23, he is describing how God protects the righteous. And in verse 23, we read, fumbling with my pages here. The steps of a man are established by the Lord, and he delights in his way. When he falls, see, there's a recognition in verse 24 that we do fall at times, we fail. When he falls, he shall not be hurled headlong. It's not devastating. It will not destroy us. It will not lose our salvation, because the Lord is the one who holds his hand. God is the one who sustains us. And then he provides food for the righteous and for others. And that's in the verse that we're in verse 25 and 26. I have been young, and now I am old. Yet I have not seen the righteous forsaken, or his descendants begging bread. And then we read in verse 26, all day long he is gracious and lends, and his descendants are a blessing. He's describing, King David is describing from his experience what he has seen. This is not a verse that promises that the believers may never go through famine, for there are believers in the Bible that went through famines, that went through difficult times. And so this is something that is important to understand here, that he is just making a statement that God generally, and that's the way, this is a wisdom psalm, and that's generally the way wisdom psalms work. Wisdom, like the Proverbs, talking about what is generally true. But if you are a believer and you live in a nation that is under divine discipline, a nation that is in warfare, a nation who has made many bad decisions in terms of government and economics, then the believer may go hungry, but God still protects you. You may have times when you miss a meal, but God watches over you. And if we go through a time perhaps of hunger, then God's going to sustain us. And if not, then God's purpose is for us to go through that suffering so that we can learn God's comfort and tell others. In these verses, we learn that God establishes our steps. Verse 23, the steps of a man are established by the Lord, and he delights in us. And sometimes he takes us through difficult times. And sometimes we're not sure what's going to happen. And that's the test, is to trust the Lord. So let's be reminded of what our memory verse is, Psalm 37:25. I have been young, and now I am old, yet I have not seen the righteous forsaken, nor his descendants begging bread. And so this reminds us of the comfort of God. And so as we study this, we will lock this into our understanding of God's faithfulness, that he takes care of those of us who are believers. We've been adopted into his family. Too often we find that people say, well, I had this happen and that happen. God just doesn't take care of me. He forgot about me. You're still alive. You haven't starved to death. God is taking care of you. God is protecting you, and God will see you through. Even if it means martyrdom, God is still sustaining us. So let's remind ourselves of our memory verse before we close. Psalm 37:25. I have been young, and now I am old, yet I have not seen the righteous forsaken, nor descendants begging bread. Psalm 37:25. So God is the one we are to look to sustain us, to provide for us, and to give us that which we need. And so keep this, memorize this, be reminded God is faithful. And next time we'll see another way in which God is faithful. One of the greatest passages on God's faithfulness in the scriptures. So until then, continue to hide God's word in your heart.